Welcome to a chilling journey through one of the most unsettling tales ever whispered through history. Passed down in fragments and rumors, this story speaks of two mysterious women said to have haunted travelers in the Appalachian Mountains. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from as we step into this haunting narrative that few dare to recount. This video is a work of fiction made purely for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. Deep in the heart of West Virginia's mountains, where fog clung to pine trees like ghostly hands, there wound a lonely dirt road twisting through forgotten valleys. It was 1908, a time when much of that land remained untouched by the outside world. Those who ventured along those trails did so out of need, never for leisure. The Appalachians hid secrets in their ancient ridges, and some of those secrets bore names: Rosie and Ruth. To the few locals who dared speak of them, they were two sisters who lived in a time-worn cabin hidden within a clearing where sunlight barely reached the soil. The old wooden house stood at a calculated bend in the main road that connected the scattered mountain towns. Tired travelers often spotted smoke curling from the chimney and felt brief comfort, believing refuge awaited them in that wilderness. From the outside, the cabin appeared humble, but inside it was surprisingly well kept. A narrow porch creaked with rocking chairs that swayed in the wind, and a thriving vegetable garden stretched behind the house, green even when nearby farms struggled to grow a thing. Rosie, the elder by a few months, had dark, loose hair that framed her sharp face. Ruth, a little shorter, wore a calm expression that unsettled anyone who looked at her too long. County records mentioned them only in passing. They paid taxes in worn coins, purchased supplies quietly in the nearest town, and vanished back into the hills before anyone could ask too much. No, one remembered when they'd first appeared there. It was as though they'd always been part of the mountain itself. The first unsettling tale surfaced when a fabric merchant passed through the region. He claimed to have stopped at the sisters' cabin, accepted a cup of tea, and then hurried away with a feeling he couldn't explain. Weeks later, his wagon was found 3 counties away, abandoned, with no horse, no goods, and no trace of the man himself. Soon, more disappearances followed. Travelers who planned to take that route never arrived. Families waited in vain for loved ones who never came home. Merchants vanished with their wares. But in those days, missing people in the mountains weren't unusual. Bears, ravines, sudden storms, nature itself was considered cruel enough without human interference. Still, the sisters' routines drew quiet suspicion. They sometimes attended the small Methodist church, sitting always in the last pew and leaving before the sermon's end. They bought strange quantities of salt and spices, but never any fresh meat. Occasionally, they sold fine animal hides, though no one had ever seen them hunt. Beneath their cabin was a deep cellar carved directly into the rock. Deliverymen spoke of an odd smell rising from below, something between wet soil and rotting herbs. Rosie always blocked the way if anyone came too close, smiling politely, though her eyes stayed cold and unyielding. Behind the house stood a large barn, far too big for 2 women with no animals of their own. Its windows were boarded shut, and thick chains secured the doors. When curious neighbors asked, Ruth would only say they kept tools and winter supplies inside. Eventually, the county sheriff, under pressure from worried families, rode up to the property. Rosie greeted him warmly, offered cider, and showed him around with practiced calm. The house was spotless, every item in perfect order. Finding nothing suspicious, the sheriff left convinced they were harmless, just eccentric recluses caught in cruel gossip. But after that visit, something in Rosie changed. She sensed danger in the growing attention. The sisters became cautious, their habits more deliberate. The disappearances slowed, as if a hidden hand had learned patience. The mountains grew quiet again, and the old rumors faded into the cold wind. By the spring of 1909, the thaw brought new travelers. Roads were clearer, trade picked up, and the cabin by the road still stood as it always had, smoke rising lazily from its chimney. Yet the forest seemed uneasy. Birds went silent near that clearing, and hunters said the air there felt heavy, almost watching. That same spring, an itinerant preacher passed through. He was a middle-aged man who journeyed from town to town spreading sermons. In his travel diary, later found among his abandoned belongings, he wrote about seeking shelter at the sisters' home during a sudden storm. Rosie had been courteous, offering him food and warmth. Ruth stayed mostly in the shadows, silent but observant. He noted an overwhelming sense of discomfort, that the shadows inside the house felt too deep, that the sisters seemed to speak without words. He left before sunrise, grateful to be on his way. No one ever saw him again. His diary became the only trace of his passing, another name added to the growing list of the vanished. Locals learned to avoid even mentioning the sisters aloud. In taverns, when outsiders asked about the women in the cabin near the bend, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes darted, and talk shifted abruptly to weather or harvests. Some whispered that the sisters practiced old mountain magic, ancient rites that the church condemned. They spoke of midnight rituals, forbidden herbs, and pacts made in the darkest corners of the forest. There was no proof, only that shared, instinctive dread that something unholy lingered in that clearing. Ruth was sometimes seen alone at dusk, wandering, with a wicker basket to collect plants. Hunters said she moved through the woods like one born of it, knowing every trail and stone. A few swore they'd glimpsed her standing motionless in the trees, watching the horizon until night swallowed her figure. The bond between Rosie and Ruth fascinated and disturbed those who observed them. They rarely spoke in public, yet seemed to communicate with glances alone, every motion mirrored, every silence loaded with understanding. Rosie made choices. Ruth carried them out. Whatever existed between them was private, impenetrable, and excluded the rest of humanity entirely. Then came the winter of 1909, merciless and long. When the snow finally melted, 3 entire families from nearby farms had vanished. Their doors were locked from within, food left untouched, and fires long gone cold. It was as if the people themselves had been erased from existence. Investigators from the cities arrived, demanding answers. They combed the mountain trails, questioned residents, and finally turned once again to the sisters. Rosie faced them calmly, her tone precise, her words deliberate. Ruth said nothing, her silence more unnerving than any confession. Her eyes were fixed on some distant point beyond the window. Nothing incriminating was ever found, no solid proof, no tangible link. The investigators left discouraged, convinced that the mountains had once again claimed their victims through misfortune or nature's cruelty. Yet among the townsfolk, a growing dread settled in a shared sense that something unspeakable was happening in those hills, something that no law or prayer could stop. The cabin remained, as constant as ever. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and at dusk, the faint glow of lamplight flickered through the windows. Rosie and Ruth carried on as they always had, buying their supplies, selling furs, and keeping to themselves at the edges of civilization. Still, the disappearances continued. Each one came just far enough apart to avoid alarm, yet often enough to keep fear alive in the quiet corners of the Appalachians. The summer of 1910 brought suffocating heat to the mountains. The air hung thick and motionless between the valleys, and when the wind did stir, it carried with it a whisper that sounded like old secrets moving through the trees. It was during that oppressive summer that a journalist from Charleston decided to look into the strange reports that occasionally reached the city, rumors of missing travelers, abandoned wagons, and the mysterious sisters said to live deep in the West Virginia mountains. He arrived discreetly, taking a modest room at a local guest house and asking his questions with caution. The townspeople, wary of outsiders, especially those who carried notebooks, were slow to talk. But patience and whiskey loosened tongues, and bit by bit, stories began to spill out. Tales of a cabin on a bend in the road, 2 reclusive women, and countless travelers had vanished without a trace. The journalist was a skeptic by nature. He had seen enough superstition dressed as truth to recognize folklore when he heard it. Convinced that the tale was nothing more than backwoods paranoia, he decided to see the sisters himself. On a stifling afternoon, he followed the winding road until the forest opened into the clearing where the cabin stood. Rosie met him at the porch with a practiced smile and offered him cool water drawn from a deep well. The shade was a relief from the heavy heat. Ruth appeared only briefly, nodded her quiet greeting, then slipped back inside the house. The journalist began with polite questions: how they managed to live so far from town, how they sustained themselves, how long they'd been there. Rosie answered easily, her tone calm and her words deliberate. She told him they had inherited the property, survived on hunting and trade, and preferred peace over the chaos of city life. Her story made sense, but something about her eyes unsettled him. They were sharp and measuring, as if she were dissecting his every expression. He suddenly felt like prey being studied by something far more patient and intelligent. He declined her offer to stay for supper and left before the sun sank too low. That evening, in his notes, he described a lingering unease, a sense of being observed, of being weighed and judged. He wrote about the unnatural silence surrounding the cabin, about how spotless everything was, and about the strange absence of insects or birds nearby. Something about the place defied nature, though he couldn't name what. For 2 more weeks, he dug deeper. He met with the sheriff, sifted through county records, and spoke with the families of those who had disappeared. Slowly, a chilling pattern formed. Nearly every missing person had been traveling that same stretch of road. Most had vanished in winter, when the snow made rescue efforts impossible. And then he noticed something even stranger: gaps in the official archives, pages missing, reports half-torn, records that should have existed simply gone. Someone, he realized, had been erasing the truth. Determined to gather undeniable evidence, he returned to the cabin one final time, this time carrying a portable camera, new technology he intended to use for his article. The morning was grey and heavy with clouds when he reached the clearing. Rosie was already on the porch, as if waiting. She didn't seem surprised to see him again, nor troubled by the camera slung over his shoulder. In fact, she smiled, but it was a knowing smile, cold and intimate, one that made his stomach twist. Ruth stepped out beside her, and together they watched him in perfect silence. He took a few quick photographs, his hands trembling slightly, and left without saying goodbye. Something in the way they stood there motionless, unblinking, filled him with instinctive fear. He returned to Charleston that very afternoon, intending to publish his findings as soon as possible. But the article never saw print. 3 days later, the journalist vanished. His boarding room was discovered in disarray, papers scattered, his notes torn, his camera smashed beyond repair. None of the photographs he'd taken were ever recovered. It was as if every trace of his investigation had been methodically erased. Back in the mountains, life carried on as if nothing had happened. The sisters continued their quiet routine, untouched and unquestioned. Fear among the locals had hardened into resignation. The cabin on the bend became a place to avoid, a warning passed between travelers. Some chose to take longer, more dangerous routes, rather than risk passing that clearing. Over the next few years, the region slowly began to change. Roads were improved, small towns expanded, and the outside world began to seep into those once isolated valleys. But the sisters' cabin remained eerily the same, untouched by time, unbothered by progress, a dark constant in a shifting world. By 1912, Rosie and Ruth still lived their peculiar, measured lives. In that year, a new hardware merchant opened shop in the nearest town. He was a meticulous man who kept detailed ledgers of every sale and customer. It wasn't long before he noticed something strange. The sisters bought chains, many chains, heavy locks, nails, digging tools, and lime in bulk quantities. When he politely asked what all of it was for, Rosie explained with her usual calm that they were reinforcing parts of their property to endure the harsh winters. It was a reasonable answer, but the merchant couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the truth. He began keeping private notes, tracking every item they purchased. Individually, the orders meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture that disturbed him deeply. One evening, over cards, he mentioned his unease to the sheriff. The lawman dismissed it with a tired shrug. "Mountain folks have their ways," he said. "Buying supplies isn't a crime." The merchant tried to let it go, but something gnawed at him. Then came autumn, bringing a violent storm that tore through the region. Trees snapped, roofs collapsed, and the main road near the sisters' property was blocked by fallen branches. Crews were sent to clear the way. While working close to the cabin, a few men reported hearing strange noises drifting from the barn, metal clanking, wood creaking, something like chains being dragged across the floor. When one worker, curious, stepped toward the structure, Ruth appeared almost instantly, her face expressionless, but her stance unmistakably forbidding. The men backed away, unsettled, and soon after, the rumors began to spread again quietly, over drinks, whispered between clenched teeth. In the weeks that followed, Rosie became more visible in town. She chatted warmly with shopkeepers, attended full sermons for the first time, and even joined a few small community gatherings. It was as though she were trying to weave herself back into the fabric of normal life, an illusion of innocence, carefully maintained while the mountains kept their secrets. Consciously, Rosie began to build a facade of normalcy, weaving herself into local life just as murmurs of suspicion were beginning to resurface. Her strategy was deliberate and effective. Gradually, the townsfolk's wary curiosity softened into tolerance. They saw her as eccentric, perhaps peculiar, but ultimately harmless, a woman who preferred solitude and the peace of the mountains to the company of others. Ruth, however, withdrew even further from the world. She was seldom seen beyond the edge of the property, and on the rare occasions she appeared in town, she never spoke a word. Some began to assume she was mute, others whispered she might be afflicted with some quiet madness. But the truth was simpler and far more unsettling. Ruth simply found no reason for idle conversation. While Rosie maintained appearances, Ruth focused on the unseen work that kept their secrets safe and buried. One summer, a traveling doctor passed through the area, offering his services to those who lived far from proper towns. During his rounds, several patients described strange afflictions, persistent unease, sleepless nights filled with vivid nightmares, and the eerie sense of being watched. At first, the doctor, a rational man trained at a respected university on the East Coast, dismissed these complaints as symptoms of isolation and the hardships of rural life. But as he listened to more accounts, he noticed a troubling pattern. All those who reported these sensations lived near the same stretch of mountain road, the one that passed close to the sisters' cabin. They all spoke of taking detours to avoid it, describing a nameless anxiety that tightened their chests whenever they came near that bend. Curiosity eventually overcame caution. Under the pretext of providing free medical care to isolated residents, the doctor made his way to the cabin. Rosie met him at the door, polite but distant. She thanked him for his generosity and assured him that both she and her sister were in excellent health. She kept the door only slightly open, never allowing him to cross the threshold. Behind her, he caught a fleeting glimpse of Ruth's silhouette framed by the window, her pale face half hidden by the dark curtains. There was something in their posture, something wordless yet unmistakable, that told him he was unwelcome. Sensing he had reached the boundary of what could safely be known, the doctor took his leave. Still, the encounter haunted him. His professional mind could find no diagnosis for the heaviness he felt near that place, something that existed beyond medicine or logic. He left the mountains a week later, but his notes remained unfinished, his final pages filled with half-formed questions that would trouble him for years. The cabin endured, as it all had, watchful, silent, and unchanging. And on nights when the moon hid behind the clouds, a few who lived nearby swore they saw movement in the clearing. Two shadows carrying heavy bundles toward the barn, their outlines barely visible against the dim glow from the house. But no one dared investigate. Fear had become part of the land itself, as old and rooted as the pine trees and the stony hills. By 1914, distant rumors of war in Europe reached even the secluded valleys of West Virginia. Yet, up in the mountains, the news felt irrelevant. Life continued in its slow, unyielding rhythm. Only the quiet dread that hung in the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing season. The trees bloomed and withered. Winters came and went. But the sisters' cabin remained untouched, unchanging, as though time itself refused to enter that clearing. That same year, a new pastor took charge of the local Methodist church. Young, idealistic, and full of conviction, he made it his mission to bring faith and comfort to every member of his scattered congregation, even those isolated deep in the mountains. He had heard the old stories about Rosie and Ruth, of course, but he dismissed them as superstition products of ignorance and gossip aimed at two independent women who lived apart from society. One mild spring afternoon, he decided to visit them himself, armed with a well-worn Bible and good intentions. Rosie met him on the porch as she always did with visitors, but something about her had changed. She looked tired, her face drawn, her complexion pale beneath the mountain light. Deep lines framed her eyes, as though years of vigilance had finally begun to wear her down. They spoke briefly about faith and the importance of community. The pastor offered prayers and companionship. Rosie listened with polite detachment, her gaze drifting repeatedly toward the dark interior of the house, as if something inside demanded her constant attention. Ruth never appeared, and, when the pastor asked after her, Rosie replied softly that her sister was unwell. The pastor left the cabin with a sense of unease. He felt he had witnessed something significant but couldn't explain what. Beneath Rosie's exhaustion, he sensed fragility, an almost human sorrow that clashed with the monstrous rumors that surrounded her. For a while, he convinced himself that the sisters were victims of cruel superstition. Perhaps they were simply misunderstood, condemned by fear and isolation. But, as he delved into the church's archives, his conviction began to falter. Among the old ledger's records of births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths, there was no mention of Rosie or Ruth. No family name, no arrival date. No trace of them before they had appeared in those mountains years ago. It was as if they had simply materialized one day, fully formed, without past or origin. He brought his findings before the church elders, but they brushed off his concerns. "Mountain records are always incomplete," one of them said. "Plenty of folks live off the books out here. Doesn't mean anything sinister." The pastor nodded but remained unconvinced. His curiosity had taken root. Throughout that summer, he made several more attempts to visit the sisters. Each time, Rosie received him courteously but never allowed him past the porch. Their conversations were brief, her tone always measured, her words always guarded. Ruth stayed invisible, though the pastor often sensed movement behind the curtains, shadows that didn't match the shifting light. One night, he dreamed of the cabin. In the dream, he was walking through a moonlit forest and came upon the barn. Its doors stood wide open, and from within poured a darkness so deep it seemed to pulse like a living thing. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, certain that what he had seen was no mere figment of sleep. When autumn came, Rosie's presence in the town ceased altogether. She stopped attending church, stopped visiting the merchants, and sent lists of supplies instead, delivered by strangers who claimed to have been paid generously for their trouble. It was as though the sisters were retreating completely, pulling away from the world that had grown too close. Then winter arrived, early, harsh, relentless, and unyielding. The snow buried the mountain roads, cutting off entire communities for months. No one saw or heard from Rosie or Ruth again that season. When spring finally returned, melting the snow and reopening the roads, a cautious anticipation spread through the valley. Some hoped the sisters had perished in the cold, others feared what they might find instead. When the first travelers passed the old clearing, they saw smoke rising gently from the chimney. The cabin stood untouched, defying the winter's wrath. Rosie was spotted once, briefly, standing on the porch. She raised a hand in what might have been greeting or warning. Ruth, as always, remained unseen. The pastor resolved to visit them one final time. Duty and curiosity compelled him in equal measure. On a clear morning in 1915, he saddled his horse and rode up the familiar road, intent on checking the sisters' welfare after the long isolation. When he reached the clearing, an unnatural stillness greeted him. Not even the birds sang. The silence felt thick, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He tied his horse to a post and walked toward the porch, each step echoing in the heavy air. No one came to greet him. He waited, then rapped gently on the door. The hollow sound reverberated through the wooden walls. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and at last he heard movement from within. Slow, hesitant footsteps echoed from within, each one deliberate, as though the person inside was still deciding whether to respond at all. The door opened only a fraction, and to the pastor's surprise, it wasn't Rosie who stood there, but Ruth. It was the first time he had ever seen her clearly, and the sight unsettled him. She bore the same face as her sister, identical in nearly every feature, yet something in her eyes set her apart. Where Rosie's gaze always carried a practiced veneer of warmth and civility, Ruth's was devoid of such pretense. Her expression was analytical, cold, as if she were studying him the way one might examine a curious specimen or an unsolved equation. He asked to see Rosie. Ruth remained silent for what felt like an eternity before lifting one pale hand and gesturing toward the interior of the cabin. The pastor hesitated. Every previous visit had stopped at the porch. Crossing that threshold felt like entering forbidden ground. Yet his sense of duty overpowered his unease, and he stepped inside. The cabin's interior was startling in its precision. Everything was spotless, arranged with an almost obsessive order. Not a speck of dust lingered, not a single item seemed misplaced. But there was also a smell strange, sharp, and unrecognizable. Not unpleasant, but unnatural. It reminded him of dried herbs and smoke, mingled with something else, something faintly metallic he couldn't name. Ruth led him silently through the main room and opened a small door at the back. Beyond it lay a dim chamber where Rosie rested on a narrow bed. The woman looked drastically changed. Her skin had taken on an ashen hue, her eyes hollowed by deep shadows. When she recognized him, she tried to smile, but even that small effort seemed to drain the last of her strength. The pastor approached her bedside, concern softening his features. He offered to fetch the town's doctor, but Rosie shook her head weakly. "No," she whispered, her voice little more than breath. "There's nothing any doctor can do. My time's simply come." Ruth stood in the doorway, watching the exchange without a flicker of emotion. Her stillness was unnerving, an observer without empathy or fear. Rosie spoke quietly, her words fragmented by fatigue. She talked of the mountains, of burdens carried for too long, of how the land always reclaims what belongs to it. Her phrases were layered with meaning the pastor couldn't decipher, poetic yet ominous. He prayed softly for her soul, clasping her frail, cold hand. When he rose to leave, Rosie's eyes suddenly flashed with clarity. She gripped his wrist with surprising strength and whispered something rapid and breathless, words the pastor couldn't fully catch. Whether it was a warning or a confession, he couldn't tell. Then she released him, falling back into her pillow, her strength spent. Ruth escorted him to the front door. Before he could thank her or offer another word, she finally spoke, her voice calm, almost musical, but stripped of warmth. "Some stories," she said, "should never be told. Some truths are too heavy for those who carry them. You'd do well to forget what you've seen here." The pastor froze. Then, without another word, Ruth stepped back into the shadowed doorway. He mounted his horse, shaken, and when he turned for one last glance, she was still there, motionless, framed by the dark timber of the porch, watching him ride away. The image of her lingered in his mind for years, fixed like a haunting photograph. He couldn't dismiss the feeling that something in that house was profoundly wrong, something beyond sickness, beyond eccentricity. There were secrets buried beneath those mountains that even time seemed unwilling to uncover. When he returned to town, he immediately tried to organize help for Rosie. He spoke to the local doctor, to church elders, to anyone who might lend aid. But everywhere he turned, he was met with silence and discomfort. People avoided his eyes, mumbled excuses, and changed the subject. It became clear there was an unspoken consensus in the valley. The sisters were to be left alone, no matter what befell them. Frustrated and unwilling to abandon them, the pastor decided to go back himself, bringing medicine and food. 3 days later, he set out again. The path to the cabin felt longer than before, the forest heavier, its shadows deeper. By the time he reached the clearing, an unfamiliar stillness hung in the air. It wasn't the usual quiet of the woods, it was the silence of finality, as though the world itself held its breath. He knocked on the door. No reply. He called their names first softly, then louder, but only his echo answered. At last, trembling, he pushed the door open. The door creaked easily under his hand. Inside, everything remained in perfect order, precise, spotless, unchanged. But the house was empty. He moved through each room, calling for them. The bed where Rosie had lain was neatly made, smooth and untouched, as though no one had ever rested there. Every drawer, every shelf was perfectly arranged. It was as if the sisters had vanished into thin air, leaving their lives frozen in place. Stepping outside, he scanned the property. His eyes fell upon the barn at the far end, the one he'd always seen from afar, forever locked and forbidden. Now, the chains that had bound its doors were undone, the padlocks hanging loosely. Heart pounding, he approached. Each step forward felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted him. He reached the barn doors and peered into the dark gap between them. The interior was shrouded in thick, unnatural darkness, swallowing what little daylight touched it. A powerful scent drifted out, the same odd herbal aroma he'd noticed inside the cabin, but far stronger, dense enough to sting his throat. Hands shaking, he pushed one door fully open. At first glance, the barn appeared empty. No tools, no furniture, just an expanse of bare earth and shadow. But the walls told another story. Deep grooves marred the wooden panels, as if something or someone had clawed at them in desperation. Dark stains spread across the boards in irregular shapes. The pastor couldn't bring himself to look closer. A sick wave of realization struck him, and bile rose in his throat. Whatever had happened there, it had been terrible. He stumbled backward, slammed the doors shut, and fled. Mounting his horse with trembling hands, he rode away as fast as he could, refusing to look back until the cabin and its cursed clearing vanished from sight. When he reached town, pale and shaking, his words came out broken and incoherent. Even then, few believed him. In the following days, the sheriff organized a formal investigation. Authorities visited the property and found exactly what the pastor had described. The pristine, empty house, the untouched furnishings, the barren barn marked with scratches and stains. But there was no trace of the sisters, no footprints, no personal effects disturbed, no clues of departure. It was as though Rosie and Ruth had simply ceased to exist, carrying with them every secret the mountains had guarded. Weeks passed, and the town sank into uneasy silence. The cabin was sealed by order of the authorities, but no one dared to approach it anyway. The air around that clearing felt poisoned, dense with something unseen but palpable, a quiet warning that the mountain did not forgive curiosity. Search parties combed the nearby trails and caves, questioning anyone who might have glimpsed the sisters. But the Appalachians are vast and merciless, full of places where people vanish without a trace. After 2 fruitless weeks, the search was abandoned, and from then on, no one in those mountains ever spoke the sisters' names aloud again. Rosie and Ruth became just 2 more names on the long, grim list of those who had vanished in the Appalachian wilderness. Yet the locals knew better. Beneath the official explanation of missing persons, there lingered a deeper conviction, an unspoken awareness that their disappearance was no accident. In hushed voices exchanged over tavern counters and within the dim glow of hearth fires, people whispered that the sisters had not been taken by the mountains, but had chosen to leave, perhaps realizing that their time, among others, was drawing to an end, that the walls of secrecy they had built were beginning to crack. Others suggested something darker, that the mountains, ancient and sentient in their own way, had simply decided to reclaim what was theirs. A farmer who lived not far from the abandoned cabin began experiencing strange disturbances in the weeks following the sisters' disappearance. He would wake in the dead of night with the distinct sensation that unseen eyes were fixed on him. His livestock grew restless and refused to graze near certain corners of his land, their agitation rising with every dusk. One moonlit night, he swore he saw 2 shadowy figures moving silently among the trees, heading deeper into the forest with a slow, deliberate grace. But when he told his story, the townsfolk only exchanged uneasy glances and told him he was imagining things that solitude and long winters could twist a man's mind. The pastor, however, was never the same. The day he stepped into that barn had marked him irrevocably. Though he continued his duties with outward calm, a distant look haunted his eyes, a quiet turmoil he could neither share nor silence. He began devoting his free hours to studying the old histories of the region, poring over forgotten records, yellowed letters, and folklore passed down by the oldest surviving families. The deeper he searched, the more patterns emerged, threads of repetition woven through generations. Every few decades, the same cycle would repeat, clusters of disappearances, followed by long stretches of uneasy calm. Always on the fringes of society, always centered around women who lived apart, women whispered to possess forbidden knowledge, keepers of traditions and rites the world had long chosen to bury. Travelers spoke of lights in the woods, of voices singing where no one should be, of encounters that defied explanation. The pastor realized that Rosie and Ruth were not anomalies, but continuations of something ancient, something that had moved silently through the mountains for centuries. One elderly merchant, after much coaxing and whiskey, finally shared a memory he had buried deep. When he was a young man, he too had encountered a pair of sisters living in seclusion, different names, different faces, yet eerily similar in every way. They vanished one winter without trace, and years later, two new women appeared in another part of the mountains, perpetuating the same chilling rumors. The merchant's trembling voice suggested what no one dared to say aloud, that perhaps these women were not individuals at all, but manifestations of something older than memory itself. That the sisters were vessels, temporary faces for a single, enduring presence, tied to the mountain's dark and unknowable will. Meanwhile, the cabin began to succumb to time. Windows shattered in storms. The roof sagged under rain. Moss and ivy crawled up its walls as nature reclaimed what had once been taken. Yet even in decay, the place radiated unease. Parents warned their children never to go near it, and even the most daring young men avoided the property after dusk. Its reputation was enough to keep even the boldest hearts at bay. Then came the summer of 1916, when fire swept through the high ridges. Flames devoured the forest with ravenous speed, consuming trees, homesteads, and several abandoned dwellings. The sisters' cabin stood directly in the fire's path, and the townspeople expected the last remnant of their story to finally burn to ash. But when the inferno subsided, the firefighters who surveyed the destruction found something inexplicable. The cabin still stood, unscathed, amid a wasteland of charred earth. The trees around it were blackened stumps, yet the structure itself was untouched, its wooden walls as whole as ever. The discovery reignited the old fears. Some called it a miracle, others a curse. The pastor visited the site days later, standing before that unburned house surrounded by ruin. A strange stillness filled the air, a sense of anticipation. He could not shake the feeling that the cabin had endured for a reason, that it waited for something yet unfinished. By autumn, the pattern returned. Travelers began vanishing again, first a peddler on his route, then a woman journeying to visit her kin. It wasn't on the same devastating scale as before, but the old dread came creeping back, seeping into daily life like fog through the valleys. Whatever the sisters had been or whatever they had served had not truly disappeared. When winter arrived early, it blanketed the mountains in heavy, oppressive snow. Roads were buried, towns isolated. The cabin, half hidden under drifts of white, became little more than a vague shadow against the hillside. Yet even unseen, its presence was felt. Locals began rerouting their travels, adding hours to avoid passing near that cursed clearing. And on the coldest, blackest nights, when the wind screamed through the ravines, some swore they could hear faint sounds from the direction of the cabin. Rhythmic, deliberate noises, the slow groan of timber, the muffled scrape of movement beneath the frozen ground. Spring of 1917 arrived reluctantly. The thaw came late, revealing a landscape twisted by the brutal winter. The trees stood bare and lifeless, skeletal reminders of what had been lost. And yet, as the snow retreated, the cabin re-emerged still whole, still untouched, standing stubbornly against nature's decay. That spring, a group of young men and women from Charleston arrived in town. They had grown up on tales of the sisters, stories passed down like ghost folklore. But to them, it was just legend, a thrill to chase, a myth to laugh at. 5 in total, full of arrogance and false courage, they decided to see the cabin for themselves one bright afternoon. They reached it easily enough. The door was still locked, but a few forceful kicks broke it open. Inside, they found everything preserved exactly as it had been left. Dust lay thick on the furniture, but nothing seemed disturbed. The dishes were still neatly arranged, the books still lined up on the shelf, as though time itself had paused the moment the sisters vanished. They explored room by room, flashlights cutting through the gloom. What began as excitement slowly turned to unease. The place didn't feel abandoned. It felt watchful, preserved with purpose. The absence of human touch was too complete, too careful. It wasn't decay, it was containment. In a bedroom drawer, one of them found a diary, its pages yellowed but intact. The handwriting was graceful, deliberate. The entries were sparse, cryptic, references to necessary work, visitors who will not understand, and sacrifices the mountains require. The words dripped with hidden meaning. Uneasy, the boy reading it snapped the book shut. Then came the sound, a slow, dragging noise from below, something heavy, scraping against stone. They froze. The sound paused, then came again closer. One of the girls whispered that they should leave, but pride and disbelief kept the others rooted. They searched for the source until they found a trapdoor to the basement locked from within. That impossibility made the air grow cold. They broke the latch and opened it. A wooden staircase led downward into a blackness so deep their flashlights barely dented it. One by one, they descended, the boards creaking beneath their cautious steps. The cellar was enormous, far larger than the cabin's foundation should have allowed its walls carved directly into the mountain's stone. The air was thick with dampness, and that same strange scent, dried herbs, smoke, and something raw and metallic. And somewhere in that darkness something shifted. In the center of the chamber stood a large wooden table, its surface carved with deep, cryptic grooves that seemed less like accidental damage and more like symbols, patterns that carried meaning beyond their comprehension. Surrounding it, shelves lined the damp stone walls, each filled with glass jars containing dark, viscous liquids and unidentifiable remains. The tools scattered across the workbenches ranged from the familiar chisels, knives and tongs to others whose purposes defied even wild guesses. Everything was cloaked in dust thick enough to mute sound, proof of long abandonment, yet the eerie precision of the arrangement suggested an obsessive order that time itself had not undone. The walls of the cellar were marked by strange etchings, ancient symbols carved directly into the rock. None of the young intruders recognized them, but their crude, deliberate strokes seemed older than the cabin itself, as if the place had once served another purpose long before. Rosie and Ruth had made it their home. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of earth and age, and with a tension that pressed down on their chests. It was the kind of silence that feels occupied, a room where something had happened, something that still lingered, though its traces had been erased. One of the boys noticed the dirt floor had been disturbed, uneven in places where the soil appeared, tamped down by repeated movement. Certain sections bore the subtle marks of frequent use paths of compacted earth that led nowhere in particular. He crouched, tracing a faint pattern with his fingers, then quickly stood. The realization came to all of them at once. They were trespassing in a space meant to remain untouched. No one needed to say it. Fear united their silence. Their retreat was frantic. The first step creaked, the second cracked, and soon they were all rushing up the stairs, stumbling over one another in blind panic. Just as they reached the main floor, that same dragging noise began again, but this time it came from outside, perhaps the barn behind the house. That was enough. They burst through the door and sprinted out into the clearing, not daring to look back until they reached the tree line. When they finally turned, gasping, the cabin stood still under the fading sun, quiet, lifeless. Then, in the upstairs window, something moved. A dark silhouette passed by, too swift to identify, too distinct to dismiss as a trick of light. None of them waited to see it again. They ran until the cabin vanished from sight and swore, through trembling breaths, that they would never speak of what had happened. But secrets like that never stay buried. Within days, their story spread through town, twisted and retold with each telling. Talk of the basement of strange carvings and forbidden rituals stirred old superstitions back to life. Reluctantly, the sheriff authorized a formal investigation. Deputies and local volunteers returned to the property, armed, with notebooks, lanterns, and unease. What they found mirrored the young people's account. The cellar was exactly as described. Photographs were taken of the wall symbols, later examined by experts who claimed they were remnants of prehistoric markings, evidence of cultures that had inhabited the mountains long before settlers arrived. The tools were logged as period-appropriate implements, though a few bore designs uncommon for the region. The jars were tested, many held preserved herbs used in folk medicine, but several contained unidentifiable compounds. There was evidence of deliberate activity, but none that proved a crime. The findings were maddeningly vague. Everything hinted at something extraordinary, yet nothing could be proven. The sheriff's men filed their reports and left with more questions than answers. Even hardened investigators admitted the atmosphere inside that basement was different, oppressive, charged. Some complained of dizziness, of pressure in their heads, or of the unsettling sense that unseen eyes followed their every move. One deputy later confessed to hearing faint murmurs from the stone walls, though he quickly dismissed it as wind through the cracks. The official inquiry was eventually closed with no conclusions. The cellar was sealed by order of the sheriff, but curiosity spread faster than ivy. Speculation thrived. Some said the sisters had been part of an old sect that worshipped forgotten gods. Others claimed the basement was a gateway, a ritual chamber designed to commune with forces beyond comprehension. No one could agree, but everyone felt the same uneasy. State authorities soon took interest. Specialists from distant cities arrived with modern instruments, turning the mountain clearing into a restricted site. Yellow cordons and armed guards surrounded the cabin. The press called it an archaeological and forensic mystery, though locals whispered that the outsiders were meddling with things better left undisturbed. The investigation promised revelations, but only deepened the enigma. Each new piece of evidence added to the confusion. Nothing explained what had truly taken place. The recovered items proved only that the sisters had lived unconventional lives, steeped in rituals and secrecy. But no document, no testimony, could link them to wrongdoing. The diary found by the young explorers was examined by handwriting experts who confirmed it belonged to Rosie. Yet its entries, filled with metaphor and veiled imagery, seemed intentionally crafted to obscure meaning. It recorded thoughts without ever confessing deeds. One passage, dated autumn 1914, captured particular attention. The mountains whisper to those who listen. There are laws older than man's and debts that must be paid in kind. Some duties defy the comfort of mercy. The words hovered between poetry and warning. For weeks, investigators debated their meaning, but none could decide if they hinted at mysticism or madness. The barn behind the house was also dismantled plank by plank. Every inch of soil beneath it was sifted and mapped. The faint grooves, once mistaken for scratches, were determined to be consistent with heavy objects being dragged. Yet again, the evidence pointed nowhere. The town grew divided. Some residents felt vindicated proof, at last, that the sisters had been hiding something. Others pleaded to leave the matter alone, warning that continued disturbance would bring misfortune. As the weeks passed, strange accidents plagued the site. Tools vanished, only to reappear elsewhere. Workers tripped over level ground. A tent containing sensitive equipment caught fire one night without clear cause. No one spoke openly of curses, but the word hung unspoken in every conversation. One lead investigator later recounted an encounter that ended his career. While working alone in the cellar one evening, he felt the air grow unnaturally cold. His breath turned to mist, and an overwhelming sense of presence filled the room. He swore he heard a whisper, not words exactly, but intent a clear message that he was not welcome. He fled and refused to return. Months passed, and the inquiry reached a standstill. The state team packed up their instruments, filing their reports with reluctant resignation. There were no bodies, no confessions, no coherent narrative, only fragments of something too vast and ancient to fit neatly into human explanation. The site was officially sealed again. Nature soon took over where bureaucracy ended. Vines climbed the boarded windows, moss crept over the timbers, and the forest slowly erased the paths leading there. The mountains seemed determined to swallow the place whole. Still, the legend endured. Stories of the sisters and their forbidden cellar continued to echo through generations, retold in whispers around campfires and in the dim corners of taverns. The names changed, but the story remained, a tale of those who listened too closely to the voices of the mountains. And perhaps, in the silence of that buried cabin, those voices still waited, patient, eternal, and unheard. Testimonies about specific incidents could not be given, and legally, no charges could be pursued. The sisters had vanished, taking with them any chance of justice. The state declared the land abandoned and decided to seize it. Plans were drawn to demolish the buildings and allow the forest to reclaim the area. However, when demolition crews arrived, they met unexpected opposition from the townsfolk. Petitions began circulating, urging that the site be preserved not as a monument, but as a warning. Heated arguments followed over what should be done with that cursed stretch of land. As officials debated, nature acted on its own. In 1918, a violent storm tore through the region, uprooting trees that had stood for centuries. When it passed, the cabin had finally fallen. The roof caved in, the walls collapsed, and what remained was a skeletal frame, buried beneath debris. The barn, too, had been obliterated, its shattered boards scattered through the forest like splintered bones. To the locals, it felt inevitable, the mountains reclaiming what had always belonged to them. The government declared the property officially abandoned, judging it too costly to clear. In the years that followed, nature buried the past. Vines climbed the remaining walls, moss crept over stone foundations, and saplings pierced the ruins where the basement had once been. The shepherd, older now, slower, and heavy with years, visited the site one last time. He stood silently, watching the wilderness erase all physical memory of the sisters. Yet he knew that not everything could be so easily erased. Their story would survive, whispered through generations, altered a little each time, some details forgotten, others born anew. He wondered about Rosie and Ruth, wherever they might have gone. Had they vanished deep into the mountains, becoming one with the land that had shaped them? Or had they simply moved elsewhere, carrying their old ways under new names? Both possibilities haunted him equally. As the sun dipped behind the trees and shadows stretched across the ruins, a realization struck him. Perhaps the sisters' full story was never meant to be known. Some truths, he thought, lingered beyond the reach of human understanding, reminders that not every mystery in the world could be solved. The mountains kept their secrets, and perhaps it was better that way. The years that followed brought change to the Appalachian region. The Great War in Europe had ended, soldiers came home, and the world seemed determined to bury its horrors and move on. The land where the sisters once lived became nothing more than a forgotten hollow, hidden by forest growth and known only to those who remembered exactly where to look. But memory is a strange thing. Though the finer details faded, the spirit of the story endured. Mothers warned their daughters against isolation. Fathers told tales by firelight of women who had lost their humanity in the deep woods. Rosie and Ruth became part of the region's folklore, inseparable from the mountains themselves. In 1921, a writer came to the area collecting legends for a book on Appalachian mysteries. He interviewed the elderly, gathering countless versions of the tale, each adding its own twist, some impossible, others chillingly vivid. He realized he was recording myth more than fact, a living story reshaped by time. Among his interviews was an especially haunting one with an old woman who claimed to have known the sisters in her youth. She described Rosie as strangely magnetic, someone who could draw people in even as she unsettled them. Ruth, she said, was like a shadow always near, yet never fully there. The woman swore they weren't entirely human, that the mountains had changed them into something other. When pressed for clarity, she only shook her head. Some knowledge, she said, couldn't be expressed in words. The sisters had touched something ancient, something older than the settlers themselves. When the book was published, it devoted an entire chapter to the sisters. The author presented their story as part history, part folklore, an inseparable blend of truth and myth. Critics praised his haunting prose, but questioned his sources. The book sold modestly, mainly among readers drawn to American Gothic tales and forgotten regional lore. Decades rolled on. The Great Depression brought hardship that made old ghost stories feel irrelevant. Then came another war, World War II, which sent the region's young men across oceans to face horrors that dwarfed the legends of home. When they returned, many carried invisible wounds, distant eyes that had seen darkness beyond what the mountains ever held. By then, the site of the sisters' cabin was nearly impossible to find, swallowed entirely by the forest. A few curious hikers sought it out, but even that interest faded over time. The land had reclaimed its silence, its secrets buried beneath moss and root. Then, in 1952, something strange happened. A woman arrived in town asking about properties in the mountains. With her was another woman slightly shorter, silent, and watchful. They said they were sisters seeking solitude and a simple life. Their appearance was ordinary enough, yet there was something unsettling about their composure, the quiet dominance of one, the intense, observing stillness of the other. An aging shopkeeper, who had been young during the first events, felt an old chill crawl down his spine. He said nothing but kept a close eye on them. The sisters purchased a small cabin deep in the hills, paying in cash enough to raise whispers, though nothing illegal. For a time, they were forgotten, just two reclusive women living quietly in the woods. Then, gradually, the pattern returned. People went missing: a traveler who never reached his destination, a salesman who vanished along his route. The echoes of the past stirred uneasily among the townsfolk. The old merchant, unable to shake his dread, decided to visit their property under the guise of offering goods. The talkative sister greeted him politely but firmly, never letting him too close. He didn't see the silent one, yet he could feel her watching from within the house. The sensation was eerily familiar, like stepping back into an old nightmare. He left unsettled, without proof, unable to explain the gnawing certainty in his heart that something very old and very wrong had returned to the mountains once more. While everyone around her grew older, faces weathered and hair silvered by the years, the woman remained almost unchanged, as though time itself hesitated to lay a hand on her. The merchant's granddaughter, now an academic and mother herself, began to notice how this subtle defiance of age mirrored the stories told of the first sisters. It was the same eerie consistency her grandfather had documented: identical behaviors, identical restraint, identical silence surrounding the second woman. She tried once again to raise the subject among local authorities, but the younger generations dismissed her the same way the sheriff had once dismissed her grandfather. They said isolation could do strange things to perception, that she was chasing patterns where none existed. But she knew better. The evidence might have been intangible, but the feeling that something enduring lived in those woods had never left her. By the late 1960s, modernization was creeping into even the most remote mountain valleys. New families arrived, drawn by cheaper land and the promise of quiet living. Yet the area around the sisters' cabin remained untouched, avoided instinctively. Locals claimed the soil there was poor or that the terrain was unstable, but none could explain why their unease ran so deep. The few who wandered too close often reported strange sensations, like being watched or hearing voices carried by the wind when no one else was near. The granddaughter continued her discreet documentation, maintaining her private journals alongside her professional career. The entries grew more fragmented as time went on, observations scribbled between teaching semesters and family obligations. "Smoke seen again," one note read. "No aging visible, the silent one still unseen." Her tone shifted gradually from skepticism to resignation. She no longer sought proof for others, she sought understanding for herself. By the winter of 1974, she made what would be her last visit to the clearing. The trail was nearly invisible beneath decades of overgrowth, but she found the place by instinct, guided by something older than memory. The cabin looked almost exactly as it had when she first arrived years before. The boards were weathered, but intact, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. As she approached, the door opened, and the talkative woman appeared just as she always had, the same smooth face, the same calm, deliberate movements. They regarded each other in silence for several moments before the woman spoke, her voice soft but commanding. "You've been watching us for a long time." The granddaughter froze. She hadn't expected to be acknowledged. The woman smiled faintly, not kindly, not cruelly, simply aware. "The mountains, remember," she said. "They keep what belongs to them." The granddaughter wanted to speak, to ask what that meant, but the words died on her tongue. Behind the woman, in the dimness of the cabin, she glimpsed a second figure standing motionless, no longer just a shadow but a shape, distinct yet indistinct, as if time refused to define her completely. That night, the granddaughter returned to town, shaken. In her journal, she wrote her final note about the sisters. "Whatever they are not bound by the same years that govern us. Perhaps my grandfather was. Right, these are not people, but continuations, echoes, the same song sung in different centuries." She never went back after that visit. Her life moved forward, as lives tend to do. She grew older, retired, and passed away quietly one autumn. Among her belongings, her children discovered boxes of notes, meticulous records of her grandfather's and her own investigations. Most dismissed them as folklore studies, curiosities of an academic mind too lost in her subject. But a few years later, in 1988, hikers reported smoke rising from a remote part of the forest, near where no roads or houses were marked on any map. When local rangers investigated, they found only faint traces of a trail leading deeper into the mountains. It ended at a clearing where the remnants of an old cabin stood, its structure partially rebuilt, smoke still curling from a chimney of freshly placed stone. The area was silent except for the rustle of leaves. No footprints, no tools, no evidence of human life, just the faint scent of wood smoke and a small trail of ash fading into the wind. Those who ventured near said they sometimes heard voices at dusk, carried through the trees, one speaking softly, the other silent. And though no one could ever confirm what they saw or who they heard, one truth remained constant through every retelling. The sisters, whatever they truly were, still lingered somewhere in those mountains, watching, waiting, and the mountains, eternal and indifferent, continued to guard their secrets just as they always had, leaving indelible impressions on all who encountered her. The silent sister remained little more than a spectre never fully seen, yet always felt like a shadow that lingered just beyond the edge of sight. At times, the researcher began to wonder if there truly were two women at all, or if one person was skillfully playing both parts, using light, angles, and distance to maintain an illusion of duality. But multiple accounts from different witnesses, each swearing they had seen the pair together, made such a theory implausible. By the 1970 seconds, a new cultural movement had begun, drawing waves of young idealists into the mountains, men and women eager to abandon modern life and return to nature. Some built communal settlements, others sought solitude in the deep woods. The researcher watched this resurgence with growing unease, knowing these newcomers, unburdened by the weight of old stories, were unknowingly settling dangerously close to the sisters' domain. She tried, subtly, to warn them, sharing fragments of folklore and half-remembered tales over coffee and campfires, but the young dismissed her as a relic of superstition, exactly the kind of thinking they had fled the cities to escape. Then came the disappearances. At first, they were attributed to inexperienced city dwellers unprepared for the wilderness. A young man vanished while foraging for mushrooms. A woman who explored nearby caves alone never returned. Search parties scoured the woods but found nothing. The mountains, patient as ever, gave up no secrets. The researcher saw the pattern instantly. Every missing person shared the same traits. They lived alone, had few connections, and would not be missed for long. It was a methodical selection disguised as coincidence, predation masked as misfortune. She chronicled each event in painstaking detail, her growing archive filling boxes with notes, maps, and clippings. By 1982, the weight of unanswered questions became unbearable. She decided to confront the sisters once and for all. Armed with decades of documentation, she drove up the narrow, twisting path to their home on a grey autumn afternoon. The talkative sister answered the door, her expression flickering from surprise to faint recognition. This time, there was no polite refusal. She invited the researcher inside, an invitation never before offered. The interior was exactly as the researcher had imagined it would be. Immaculate, almost ceremonial in its order. Objects were arranged with obsessive care. Yet amidst the cleanliness lay something more troubling: ancient books with cracked bindings, jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and maps of the surrounding mountains covered with strange symbols and handwritten notes in languages she couldn't read. It was a library of forbidden knowledge, compiled over what felt like centuries. The silent sister sat in a rocking chair near the hearth, her face half hidden in the dim light. When she finally turned, the researcher's breath caught. The sisters were identical, not merely similar, but indistinguishably so. The same features, the same expression, mirrored perfectly. It was as though she were looking at two incarnations of one being, divided by something other than time. The ensuing conversation was surreal. The talkative woman answered questions in riddles and metaphors. She spoke of cycles of nature, of ancient laws that predated humanity, of mountains that remembered and enforced their own order. Her voice carried the weight of something vast and impersonal. Whenever the researcher pressed for clarity, dates, origins, evidence, the woman would drift into abstraction, speaking of the balance, of continuity, of the price of understanding. Then, unexpectedly, the woman asked a question of her own. "Do you truly wish to know?" she said. "To see as we see? To understand what lies beneath what you call truth?" Her tone was neither threatening nor kind. It was simply final, an opening to something irreversible. The researcher hesitated. For decades she had sought this moment, but now, faced with it, dread eclipsed curiosity. When the silent sister raised her gaze, meeting hers directly for the first time, the researcher felt an overwhelming sense that accepting the offer would cost her something far greater than knowledge. She refused. Quietly, she thanked them both, gathered her notes, and left the cabin. As she drove away, the rearview mirror reflected two motionless figures standing on the porch, identical silhouettes, watching her go. She never returned. In the years that followed, she transformed her research into a book presented as a scholarly study of Appalachian folklore and the psychological roots of rural legends. The book sold modestly, mostly to academics, but a few readers recognized what she had hidden between the lines, that beneath the careful language of anthropology lay an unspoken confession of truth. Letters trickled in from those who understood, who had seen similar patterns in their own corners of the world. Time moved on, but the sisters remained. Sightings continued in whispers, always vague, always unverified. The cabin persisted, untouched by decay, the mountains keeping their eternal vigil. Generations passed, yet the legend endured, reshaping itself to fit each new age. The researcher grew old and, at last, returned to the region where her family's story had begun. She chose a home far from the clearing, content to let the past fade. But on certain nights when the wind shifted and the forest murmured, she thought she could hear faint voices carried through the trees, one speaking softly, the other silent. When she died, her estate bequeathed her lifetime of notes to the county library. The collection was catalogued, boxed, and forgotten among endless shelves of obscure histories. Yet every few years, someone would stumble upon it, some curious student or local historian, and the story would begin again. The Appalachian Mountains remain what they have always been, ancient, vast, and indifferent. In their hidden valleys, where the modern world falters and silence still reigns, forces older than memory continue to move unseen. Some say the sisters are still there, unchanged, waiting, and perhaps that is how it should be. Some stories are not meant to resolve. Some truths cannot survive the light. They live, instead, in the shadows, half-remembered, half-believed, whispered from generation to generation, until legend and reality are one and the same. If you've journeyed this far into the darkness of the mountains, thank you for listening. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts below, and tell us which forgotten legend should be unearthed next. Until then, we'll meet again somewhere deep within the shadows of history.